Ma chère Nora, my dear Nora, had we not been struck with COVID-19, as you said earlier, your bat mitzvah would have taken place last May, and you would have read a parashah from the end of Leviticus. The pandemic, in its second year then, was still raging, and more restrictions were still to come. But today, surrounded by your family and friends from France, Switzerland, Spain, and Israel, as well as nearer to home, you learned a completely different parashah, and you read that so beautifully from the end of the book of Shemot, of Exodus, and you demonstrated your understanding of these deeply spiritual verses that describe the presence of God filling the Mishkan, as well as your gift for learning languages. I know that in the midst of this lovely celebration, we are aware of the dark shadow of the war in Ukraine, and we are all affected profoundly by the sinister images of Russian tanks lined up outside Ukraine's capital, by the aftermath of cruise missiles and vacuum bombs that are erasing cities, and the humanitarian tragedy that has resulted in over 1 million people leaving Ukraine. Loss of homes and the utterly pointless deaths of whole families and soldiers defending their homeland, as well as the young Russian conscripts, many of whom feel duped by their government into a war they do not wish to fight. It is hard to see in the unfolding events of this war any hope that Ukraine will emerge undefeated. Yet there is a courageous spirit and determination in the Ukrainian people to hold on not only to their land, but to the values they have embraced of freedom and democracy. And it is difficult to know what to say at a time like this. Our heart goes out to all those affected by this terrible conflict, those in Ukraine, those fleeing to the border and crossing into neighboring countries, families who have been left bereaved of loved ones and who have lost everything, people all over the world with ties to Russia and Ukraine, distraught, scared, and feeling utterly helpless. Earlier this week, Rabbi Igor and I had a conversation with one of our colleagues, the rabbi of the progressive Jewish community in Odessa. Russian-born, she was forced to flee with her 19-year-old daughter to Lviv in western Ukraine, and then on to the Polish border. She walked for 40 hours in freezing temperatures. There was nowhere to rest. They carried all their clothes on their backs and were forced to wait for hours before being able to cross the border. Now in a safe house in Warsaw, she said that she never dreamt that she, a rabbi, would ever become a refugee. Now there are over 1 million like Rabbi Yulia, uprooted from their homes, separated from loved ones, from their communities and their work by the cataclysmic events of the last 9 days. In the midst of a humanitarian crisis that grows more serious as each hour passes, we cannot make any sense of this war. It is human stories like Rabbi Yulia's and countless others that capture our imagination and evoke admiration. These stories occur in the moment, and our reaction to them is often visceral: anger, frustration, pity, helplessness. We cannot even find the words to describe the brutality and madness of this war. But if we turn to the texts of our tradition, we find a different context and words that help us to reflect the tumultuous violence of another era. Here is the responses of the sages of the Talmud, who sought to make sense of a devastating war that had occurred more than a century earlier. You have a very favorable attitude to the technology. Mine is more stressful. This is the passage from the Talmud. The sages taught, 3 sounds travel from one end of the world to the end of the other. The sound of Galgal Chama, the revolution of the sun, the sound of Hamonah Shel Romi, the tumultuous hosts of Rome, and the sound of Neshama B'Sha'ah Sheyotz'a Min Haguf, the sound of the soul at the moment it leaves the body. What did the rabbis mean by this passage? In the centuries in which the rabbis lived, they saw what they thought was the movement of the sun rising at dawn and setting at dusk, and did not conceive of the earth rotating on its own axis. The Galgal Chama, the sound of the sphere of the sun reverberating from one end of the world to the other, may be a reference to the sounds of matter and energy that course through space and that are heard from one end of the world to the other. But a metaphorical interpretation might hear in this phrase the thunderous sound that is heard in the heavens and which comes as a warning about the unpredictable nature of events driven by uncontrollable forces of evil and power. Hamonah Shel Romi, the tumultuous hosts of Rome, is undoubtedly a reference to Roman oppression a century and more earlier, to the plundering of Judea in the centuries that saw the destruction of the temple and the brutal crushing of Jewish rebellions against Roman rule. It is a phrase that summons up images and sounds of battle, missiles and bombs erasing cities, the cries of terrified residents, convoys of tanks rolling through city streets, burning buildings, and the sound of falling masonry into the streets below. And the third sound, the sound of the soul as it departs from the body, is that moment of a last breath and the separation of the soul from the body. It is the anguished weeping of mourners, but it is also the sound of the soul of the world as it leaves this earth, the soul which encapsulates everything we hold dear, our love of truth and freedom, human kindness, and the sanctity of human life. When pity leaves the world, so does an order based on international rules, and in its place a new world order enters the world of cruelty and barbarism, deceit and violence. These are the sounds, the things that make our world tremble for the future, a scorched earth wrecked by the devastating consequences of artillery, the crushing defeat of an independent free nation, and the loss of a world order that prevents us from killing each other. The Talmud, in its succinct way, does not end with just these words, these 3 things, but it adds another voice, another sound. V'yesh omrim af leda, And there are others who say that there is another sound that is heard from one end of the earth to the other, the sound of birth, the sound of new life as it comes into the world. Its sound too reverberates from one end of the world to the other. But this time, the sound represents not despair and destruction, but hope. As Rabbi Igor said in his thought for the week yesterday, drawing from the words of your Torah portion, Nora, which describes the pillar of cloud that fills the Mishkan by day and the fire that appeared by night. During darkness, God sends us a message of hope because it is good, not just because it stands a chance to succeed. Let us not let go of hope, tikva, a hope that is inspired by the courage and resilience of the human spirit, and that holds up to the light the sanctity of human life, the rule of law, freedom, and peace. Nora, I have many memories of seeing you in Rimon over the years, your smiling face, your liveliness and happy spirit. Running down the corridor to your classroom upstairs, I remember you always stopping to say hello, asking me how I am, always with that lovely manner that both you and Eva have, courteous, well-mannered. Today you have shared with us your passion for Judaism, your love for this community, and the stronghold of your family, many of whom have traveled a distance to be with you today. And you have set us such a wonderful example this morning by your generosity in donating funds to help people in Ukraine. For we know that what is most needed at the moment is indeed funds, money. The Talmud acknowledges the history of our suffering under Roman rule and suggests in its metaphors and images the devastation wrought on our communities in later centuries, the Crusades, expulsions, pogroms, and the Shoah. Many must have been the times when Jews thought the sun had set on their world and the soul of the Jewish people had been extinguished forever. But we never lost hope. We never conceived of a world that would return to chaos and nothingness. The darkness will give way to light, and the sun will rise with healing on its wings. May that day come soon, and in our days, bimheira v'yameinu, v'nomar, Amen.